The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
In recent years, many observers have become concerned about the quality of public schools. But as the federal government, state governments, city mayors, school boards, teachers' unions, education researchers, and others have worked hard to improve American public education, some are having second thoughts about the effectiveness of testing and school choice, fearing that they are ineffective or even counterproductive. Joining us to discuss her views on the right way forward for U.S. education policy is Diane Ravitch, former Assistant Secretary of Education under President George H.W. Bush, and author of The Death and Life of the Great American School System, How Testing and Choice Are Undermining Education. And now the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Diane Ravitch, welcome back to Policy Watch and the University of Maryland.
Thank you. It's great to be with you, Doug.
So you're the author of this much acclaimed book, The Death and Life of the Great American School System.
Yes, indeed.
I want to take a piece of it, the achievement gap. Because although we'd like all schools and all students to do better, that seems to be a human desire, there are many young children, mainly of ethnic and racial minorities, who are left behind. Tell us about them.
Well, there is an achievement gap, and one thing that No Child Left Behind has done is that by disaggregating the scores between racial and ethnic groups and everybody else, the gap becomes very clear. It's important to understand, though, I'm a historian, there have always been achievement gaps. When the Irish came to America, they were way behind. When the Italians came to America, they were way behind. Every group that has arrived in our society and was a newcomer had an achievement gap with those who had the language and had the background and the education, so that they came from educated families.
So this leads me to a different question, which is a little bit of a detour. Does the fact that you are a historian by training affect the way you look at the problem of education in America?
Well, what it should do is to make me wary. Usually I'm very wary of simple answers. Occasionally, as I explain in this book, I made the mistake of falling for some myself. Even though most of my career as a historian has been a series of books warning not to fall for the latest grand idea. And I think that, you know, my hope to find solutions, and I shouldn't be in the business of finding solutions, but you can't help it. You know, if you're alive and breathing, you want to help people. And so I fell for the idea that maybe testing, maybe accountability, maybe the market and choice might move things along. And it took a while to see that things were not working out as I had hoped or as many other people had hoped. And so I had to make a break and basically repudiate some things that I had written. Fortunately, none of my books are written about that. But I think that in articles and you know, short pieces, I had expressed things that I now say, I was wrong. And I think it's, you know, if you're living and breathing, you have to say once in a while, I looked at the evidence and I was wrong. The famous line of John Maynard Keynes, he says, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?
Well, I wonder whether you were wrong or whether the ideas might have been right at 10,000 feet, but the implementation was wrong. And I don't think, my guess is, in principle, you'd still be in favor of, quote, accountability. It's a question of whose accountability and how.
Well, it's a question of what do you mean by accountability?
Sure.
Because in the book, I say, for instance, I'm not opposed to testing. I think testing is very important. You need to test to find out how you're doing, how students are doing, whether they're moving forward or backward. The question is, how do you use testing? And I think we've been misusing testing. We've been using testing not for diagnostic purposes, not for informational purposes, but for punishment purposes. And to say, you're going to be failed, you're going to be fired, and this school is going to be closed. So I think that we should take all what we learn from tests to help kids, to help teachers, and to improve schools. But that's accountability too. I call that positive accountability.
And I think, and so I'm just trying to defend you. And
Okay.
I'm trained as a lawyer.
Good. Defend me against myself.
Yes, well, because I think those ideas, market forces are right. It's just a question of
I think market forces are right in the right place. Yes. But I mean, I would not want to live in an economy that was not a market economy. But I would not want to see the fire department in a market economy, because then we would all have to bid for the services to have someone come and put the fire out at our house.
Careful, someone will decide that's a good idea.
No, it's a bad idea. I don't want to see the police department privatized. There's certain services that must be public services and public goods. And this is why I think that we have public education, because if you go back in history, when we didn't have public education and everybody had to do it for themselves, many children got no education, and it was far worse than what we have now. So with all of our complaints about public education, it's better than totally privatizing it. I just think the market is the wrong mechanism for distributing goods and services, because what we want, or at least what I want, is to see a good school in every neighborhood, and the market's not going to provide that.
Let's look at some of these issues, and we just said from 10,000 feet. Probably one of the most contentious issues in education is the role of unions. And you have some people saying, my God, the unions are their problem. If they only didn't have these rigid rules about who does what and when, and if we could only fire people more easily, why the schools would be better.
Well, I think that's wrong. And the proof is that the highest performing state in the United States is Massachusetts. Massachusetts is #1 on the national assessment examinations, the federal examinations. #1 in math, #1 in science, #1 for 4th grade and 8th grade. Those are all the subjects and grades that are tested. It's 100% union. The union, and people will complain about the union in Massachusetts just as they do everywhere else, but it has not prevented the highest achievement in the U.S. If you look internationally, the highest performing nation in the world on one of the major international assessments is called the Program in International Student Achievement. It's PISA. Highest performing is Finland, 100% unionized. It's not the union that got in the way of achievement. I mean, we have so many factors in this country that militate against achievement. One is we have schools that have no curriculum, none. To me, the biggest lacking in American education is the fact that we don't have a curriculum, and we furthermore don't have even a vision about what education ought to be. I mean, my vision is a well-educated person is somebody who not only has the basic skills down pat, which you should, of course, everyone should have, but someone who studied history, read literature, geography, civics, understands what the government is, how it functions, knows how to participate in it.
But I want to go back to unions for a second.
Okay.
Because I've heard you say, and it's quite striking, that a new role for unions, or at least what has made their traditional role more important, has been mayoral control of schools. Because suddenly it seems as if the school districts are run with the ability to make radical change quickly with no accountability.
Well, what I'd said about the union in that context was that with so much pressure for testing and with the mayor having so much power, the teachers have to have a voice. You cannot have a situation where the mayor has autocratic power and can hire and fire people at will, because it easily can be corrupted. You can imagine, you can in your own head think of mayors you have known and not loved, who given that power would have hired every relative they ever had, the relative of everybody who was in their clubhouse, and where this could easily be corrupted. But more importantly than that, I think that unions serve a function for teachers of protecting due process. I think due process is important. People should not be fired without cause. They should be able to have a hearing. Is this just an arbitrary decision? Did they fire you because of your race, or because of your religion, or because you were gay, or because of something else that they didn't happen to like?
No. And in your book, though, you also make the point, I think, that unions serve a quasi-political purpose. If the mayor and the appointed superintendent have almost absolute power to reorganize the school system, not just to hire and fire, but to change the structure and to change the curriculum. I don't want to say at a whim, because I don't believe mayors do things necessarily on a whim. I don't want to think that. It's the union that can be the stabilizing force. Isn't that part of your argument?
Yes, I think that it's a counterforce, because I live in New York City, and this is an unusual situation which might or might not spread, where the mayor has virtually unlimited power. There's a completely toothless and powerless board, which he ignores because he appoints the majority of them. They serve at his pleasure. And so if he decides to reorganize the system, or if the chancellor wants to reorganize it, they reorganize it. They have no one that they have to talk to.
And they've done that 3 times?
Yeah, repeatedly. And you know, first it was tightly centralized, then every school was on its own bottom, and it's sort of hard to know from day to day whether there's another reorganization coming down the pike. But the union does provide a kind of a counterweight at a point where there are no checks and balances. And so the union protects the teachers from arbitrary dismissals, but it also provides some kind of a political counterweight where periodically they have to consult with the union before they do something that's completely arbitrary and capricious.
Well, before we go too far complaining about mayoral control of schools, the old boards of education didn't do a very good job either, did they?
Well, I think that I don't think they did a terrible job. If you look across the country, the form of control is not in itself an independent factor. If you look, you know, the only test that I feel very good about citing are the national assessments, the federally sponsored tests, because nobody's rigging the scores there and moving them up and down. The highest performing districts in the country are Austin and Charlotte, North Carolina. And these are districts that do not have mayoral control. They have school boards. The lowest performing districts in the country are Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Cleveland. All three, well, Washington was lowest before it had mayoral control, and now it has mayoral control, and it's been improving. But it's still among the lowest. Cleveland and Chicago have had mayoral control for more than 10 years. They're amongst the lowest in the country. So you can't say that mayoral control will lead to vast improvements. It might or it might not. It's not really not the independent factor. I think the independent factor that leads to vast improvements is having a coherent, solid curriculum so the teachers know what they're expected to teach, students know what they're supposed to learn, and they build their knowledge and become more competent as learners.
We don't have curricula, do we, that have been tested under various conditions and proven to be effective?
Well, I could give you 2 examples. One would be Massachusetts. And Massachusetts, as I said earlier in the show, is the highest performing state in the country. And when students in Massachusetts competed almost as if they were an independent nation in the Third International Math and Science Survey, which is given to nations all over the world, they were first or second in the world.
Now that's a turnaround in Massachusetts, right?
Well, it was never a terrible state, but what Massachusetts has is a really fabulous standards curriculum. Teachers are trained to teach that. They know what they're going to teach. It's a very knowledge-rich curriculum.
And the school, there was a statewide appointed school board
Yes.
that drove some of that reform?
Right, and the governor appointed the school board, the state school board. So, you know, that was contentious. The union didn't like it, but eventually they went along. The teachers recognized that the kids were making progress. It's become institutionalized, and now they have the rewards of this incredibly wonderful performance. So that I think is a good example. The other good example...
Let me back up, though. So if we think that worked, are there any other states or school systems that are trying to emulate that, or is the Obama administration saying, let's look at that and see what lessons we can learn for the rest of the country?
Well, the Obama administration is really not supposed to do anything curriculum because there is actually a federal law that says the Federal Department of Education is not supposed to impose any curriculum. Now, what's happened is that they've given money, and the Gates Foundation has given money to the National Governors Association, the chief state school officers, and they have created what they say are national standards. The other example I was going to give of a really wonderful curriculum is called Core Knowledge, and it was promulgated by a group in Virginia associated with Professor E.D. Hirsch, Jr., and there are about 1,000 schools nationally that have used it, have gotten wonderful results, and it's basically a K-8 curriculum where the kids have all the things I've been talking about, science and history and literature, and they do projects and activities. And what makes the kids smart is that they learn a lot of things. They learn a big vocabulary. They learn what the words mean. They're not just studying to take a test, and they do very well on tests because they've got that wonderful base of knowledge.
Well, you mentioned a moment ago the Gates Foundation, and in your book you call a group of these foundations the Billionaires Club.
The Billionaire Boys Club.
Boys Club, okay.
Yeah, it's the Billionaire Boys Club. They're all boys.
Well, I think Mrs. Gates is active in the Gates Foundation, right?
She's part of the Billionaire Boys Club, too.
Okay. So who are they, and what are they doing?
Well, what we have today in America is something unprecedented, really, in our history, which is a group of very huge foundations, particularly the Gates Foundation, that believe that they are so wise and so smart that they should direct American education policy. And they have had immense influence at the U.S. Department of Education, and they will give a grant. The Gates will give a grant of $50 or $100 million, and so Pittsburgh or this city or that city, cities all over the country will stand in line saying, I want the money, I'll do whatever you want. They prostrate themselves before the Gates Foundation. But basically, the Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, and the Walton Foundation, which are the three I look at, want to impose a kind of a market model of charter schools and evaluating teachers by test scores and longer school days, longer school years. And so right now, these are the mantras they have. The Gates Foundation previously put $2 billion into breaking up large high schools. And after several years of that, they decided that was not working out so well, so they dropped it. They left thousands of small schools behind, but they've moved on and they're no longer doing that.
And we should emphasize, as you do in your book, it's not as if these foundations are all of one ideological or political bent. Walton, I think, is a conservative Republican.
Walton's very conservative, and Gates and Broad would say that they're Democrats. But as Democrats are on that side of the spectrum, they have nonetheless gotten very much in line behind the idea of charter schools, which I would say are a form of privatization, because when you take away public control and put it in private hands, it's privatization. I don't know what else to call it.
Yeah, but I've been always struck by the fact that unions are so much against vouchers, but they seem to endorse charter schools.
Well, it's a paradox, because actually 95% we have 5,000 charter schools now, and at least 95% of them are non-union and will never be union, because the teachers work 50, 60, 70 hours a week. So it's inconceivable that what the unions would expect, which is a contract with working hours and the typical 35-hour a week or whatever that number is, simply wouldn't fit the model that most of the charter schools rely on.
It's a wonder to me. Let me try something. You've talked before about all the factors that shape a child's performance in school and in later life: family, neighborhood, temperament, the child's own temperament.
Motivation.
And then we have the teacher. And I teach, and I would be horrified if the only judgment that was made about me was how well my students learned. Although I suppose I want a little bit of that.
So every time one of your students failed an exam, you're a failure?
I said a little bit of that I wouldn't mind. But I don't sense in the school reform movement, with an exception that I'd like you to talk about, I don't sense, I hate to use this word, but a more holistic approach, a more complete approach to the factors that shape student achievement.
Well, in the 2008 election, there were two factions that emerged. One was associated with Chancellor Joel Klein of New York City and Chancellor Michelle Rhee of D.C., and their argument was talking about poverty is just an excuse. Forget about poverty. Poverty has no impact whatever on whether kids perform. Everything is about having teachers. It's all on the teachers, plus charter schools, plus more testing. So this was the mantra, and it was, Klein, Rhee, Al Sharpton, Newt Gingrich, people of that sort. And then the other group, which I associated myself with because I thought they were right, was called the Broader, Bolder Agenda, BBA. They still have a website that's up. Both groups still exist. The Broader, Bolder Agenda said, of course academics are important. This is what schools do, but they'll do it best if children arrive in school healthy, if their parents have a reasonable opportunity to get a job and give them a decent living environment, and if the different parts of a child's life are supporting what's supposed to happen in school. So yeah, I believe that if you look at social science research, whether it's the Coleman Report or 1,000,001 studies that have been done, poverty matters. Poverty hurts children, and poverty is not a life sentence because lots of people do escape it. Schools are very important to help kids escape from poverty. And demography is not destiny, but demography really stacks the odds against you. Poverty stacks the odds against you. And so what we should be aiming to do is to change that balance of the odds so that kids who are in poverty don't suffer all the burdens that are typically associated with being desperately poor.
That, however, that makes sense, but it doesn't address the other aspects of, it seems to me, of making a school work, because that didn't address the parents' attitudes towards homework. It didn't address the community's attitudes towards education. And it didn't address maybe the safety of the school or just the atmospherics of the school. How do you do those other things?
All of these things are important. And one of the things that I emphasize in the book is that the one thing that public education should learn from the best charter schools is the importance of a safe and disciplined environment. And many public schools have lost control because there have been so many court rulings and so many different kinds of legislation that have made it hard to maintain a safe and disciplined environment that it affects the ability of teachers to teach and students to learn. And I've heard from many, many teachers who say if they have one or two children in the classroom who are disruptive, and if that child is, let's say, special ed, and they're afraid to violate some law, or they assume that there's a law that say they must keep then the whole classroom is ruined. So in effect, we are reaping a generation of litigation and court rulings and legislation that have tied teachers' hands. And even if they're really not tied, they think they are. And what the charter schools have done is to say, we're going to ignore all of that, and we're just going to focus on having a safe, calm environment where kids can learn. And I think that the public schools ought to take that idea and restore what's needed in the classroom.
Now, there's nothing in Race to the Top that rewards school system. This is the Obama administration plan to improve public schools. There's nothing there about these topics.
No, the focus in the Obama plan is more charter schools and more use of testing, and also what they call the turnaround strategy. The turnaround strategy is you basically come in and say to a school, if you don't improve your test scores, you're going to be closed down. And the president has said that in various speeches that he'd like to see 5,000 schools either turned around or closed. So we're going to see public schools closing all over this country in the next 4 years. And I think it's a very frightening time for public education. It's a perilous time. And as a historian, I have to say that there's never been a time when public education in the United States was in greater peril. It will be okay in affluent suburban communities, maybe, but there are lots of parts of this country where the regular schools are being emptied out of kids who are then going into the privatized schools, leaving behind the hardest to educate kids, which will then make it even harder to run a decent public school.
I simply don't get it. The teachers are probably the second largest contributors to Democratic politicians, the first being the trial lawyers, and they've gone and taken care of health care. But here, this is such a major constituency. What was it, 1 in 5 people at the Democratic convention was a school teacher? I mean, this is a major Democratic constituency. And yet, from what you say, we're headed towards a catastrophe, and yet the Democratic politicians seem to be, I don't want to say part of the problem, but not fighting back.
It's bizarre, and I'm not active in any party politics, but I've talked to lots of teacher groups, I've talked to union groups, and I've talked to the Association of Administrators, and they all say, what can we do? We're powerless. And I say, what do you mean you're powerless? You've got millions of members, millions of people in the NEA, millions of people in the AFT, lots and lots of administrators, and yet everyone's sitting around, what should we do? And there are things that they could be doing, and they're not. And I hope that, I think the problem is they know how to criticize Republicans. They know how to condemn George W. Bush. They don't know how to argue or criticize Barack Obama because he's their man. They put him there, and they don't want to fight him.
Your book is the death and life of the great American school system. So before we end, tell me something about life.
The reason that I have that title is because it is borrowed from Jane Jacobs, who wrote the great book about criticizing urban planning. And when she wrote her book in the 1960s, the urban planners were demolishing neighborhoods and putting up soulless high-rise buildings where there were no eyes on the street. And so she made the argument that there should be regeneration of the cities and the old neighborhoods before it was too late. And so immodestly, I said, gee, I hope that it's not too late to save and regenerate American public education, particularly in the urban areas, because most of us are of an age where we can remember when the urban districts had wonderful schools, and they could again, but we have to put our shoulders to the wheel and change things. We cannot allow them to be privatized, dismantled, closed, and replaced by soulless high-rise buildings where only the most successful are allowed to enter and everybody else gets stuck in the schools of last resort. So it's a hope for a renaissance.
And I take it that the response of the book gives you more hope?
Well, it's been astonishing. I mean, the book came out March 2nd, and within 3 days it had sold out everywhere. And they're rushing out a second printing and a third printing. And, you know, as somebody who has written lots of books and never seen this kind of response, frankly, I'm overwhelmed. And most gratifying has been being overwhelmed by emails from teachers who say, thank you. That's the best.
Yeah. Well, on that note, Diane Ravitch, thank you so much for being with us at Policy Watch and the University of Maryland. And for our viewing audience, if you have any questions or comments, as always, you can reach us at PolicyWatch@UMD, that's UMD for University of Maryland, .edu. Thanks again for being with us, and thank you again, Diane Ravitch.
Thank you.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.